Welcome, everybody. My name's Simon Cox. I'm a journalist at The Economist magazine based here in Hong Kong. And I'm delighted to be here with my friend and former colleague, Sitao Xu, who is now Chief Economist for China at Deloitte, was formerly at the EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, as their forecasting director and chief representative in China. Before we get started, I have an announcement to make. If there are any correspondent members, journalist members in the room, I want to remind you that we're conducting a survey on press freedom, and that's closing this week. You should have an email about it with a link to the survey, or you can pick up a hard copy at reception downstairs. Well, one of my favorite quotes from Deng Xiaoping is, "Development is the only hard truth." I think I like that quote because I'm a development economist by training, but I think it also conveys something quite important about the prevailing governing philosophy of China in the reform and opening up period. The idea that growth was the overriding goal, the idea that growth and development were an essential source of legitimacy, and the idea also that development was the principal test of a policy, the test of what works and what doesn't work. That was a governing philosophy that many people, including in the West, were very comfortable with. Now, clearly now, there's an alteration to that governing philosophy. Growth is not the only goal. Now, in some ways, that's a sign of success. China is on the verge of becoming a high-income country by World Bank definitions. And once you achieve that level of prosperity, I think it's right, natural, to be expected that other goals beyond material prosperity become important. Goals like protecting the environment, for example, goals like establishing better family relationships. But it's also perhaps a source of concern that growth is no longer the only goal, because it means the test of what counts as a good policy has become more complicated. And I think that may be causing a certain amount of confusion, even amongst the cadres who have to follow the leader's guidance very closely. So we're here to discuss China's new qualified view of growth. Mere expansion is not enough. It has to be high-quality growth. We're going to talk about what the government means by high-quality growth. We're going to talk about what the government should mean by high-quality growth. We're going to ask whether China is in fact capable of it. And we're also going to ask, if China's growth has to be high quality, can it also be high speed? Sitao, a lot to discuss there. Before we get on to some of those deeper issues, I'm actually quite keen to get your view on the latest economic news out of China. Yesterday, China did its monthly data dump, where it updates us on retail sales, industrial production, property sales. And although those numbers look very, very strong compared with April of last year, of course, was a disastrous month. And in fact, those numbers that they released yesterday missed expectations. So how do you think growth is right now? Set aside the quality of the growth. Yeah. How strong is it?
Yeah. So yesterday's data release clearly have painted a very mixed picture. So if you look at investment, it was uniformly weak. Particularly property sector. In fact, this is something actually people really watch very carefully. For quite a few consecutive months, property investment has been just dropping, from double digit. So I think people want to know at what point we are going to see the bottom of property cycle. By the way, property developers have seen tremendous improvement in terms of their financing positions, but there is really no strong incentive for them to ramp up investment. The other number people also talk about was youth unemployment. As you know, when you talk to any employers, if a fresh graduate did not get a job, it would be more difficult for him or her to do that next year. Much tougher competition, so 20.4%, that's an alarming number. But I wouldn't get too pessimistic. I still think recovery is underway. My 2023 forecast is GDP growth 5.5%. I think government's goal of around 5% very much in the bag. I still think there are policy tools in the box.
You think those policy tools will be needed?
They are needed, but I don't think they should be overly used. If you recall, late 2018, when trade war broke out with the United States, I think the knee-jerk reaction was to crank up the old economy. But that's really not the right medicine. I think you cut interest rate, that's okay. You adjust exchange rate, I'm all for that. You deregulate certain sectors, that would be a good idea. But I don't think you need to have a large stimulus. And you can give consumption coupons as what people do in this city, but that's never a preferred approach for various reasons.
I mean, one of the numbers that was very soft was inflation, just 0.7%. People have started talking about the threat of deflation.
I think that's overdone. I have experienced severe deflation actually in this place. I used to work in Hong Kong, actually right after the handover and leading up to SARS period, and one of my former colleagues actually was here. So I think you get deflation spiral when you have asset price sharp decline, right? Sharp decline in Hong Kong. Housing prices coming down by 50%. Hang Seng was trading, I think, Robert, you can correct me, at one point, I think less than 7,000, and Hong Kong dollar peg was under threat. Unemployment rate off the chart. The whole area was like a ghost town, but I don't think China will be like that. So I don't think there's a risk of deflation.
You remind me that there's a lot of expertise in the room, and I should have said at the outset that questions are welcome at any time. Raise your hand. I'll try and see you, and just identify yourself when you ask the question. I think there are mics in the room that will come to you. So perhaps we should look at some of these deeper, longer-term issues, rather than just the monthly figures that do bounce around quite a lot. So high-quality growth. How do you think China's leaders define it, and how would you define it?
Okay. I don't think that was ever being defined by policymakers. This is actually quite normal in China. So for example, we say many things, we just don't give definition. Dual circulation, that's example, right? I mean,
that's by design?
No
definition by design?
Simon, would you give a precise definition of Belt and Road? What's your definition?
Oh, sure. You want it to be as open-ended as possible, so you don't have to admit when the definitions change.
So in October 2019, at the 19th Party Congress, the Chinese government made this quite a prominent mention of a comparison between high speed and high growth. So certain concept words being introduced. I think one was indulgence, meaning growth coming within your body, right? I mean, so that's more sustainable. Environment was being highlighted, and innovation was being mentioned. And also, there were other discussions on better income distribution. Now, if you look at policy responses after the 19th Party Congress, for example, clearly we know, right? I mean, certain sectors are being viewed more desirable. I think policymakers have felt advanced manufacturing industry should be the way to go. New alternative energy sector, and some other sectors were being viewed less positively. So, for example, gaming, right? Gaming. So I think we know there is a policy preference, and there were also discussion on disordered. How do you say that? Disordered capital. Expenditure of capital. So I think that's a very long-winded way to answer you. What's the government's definition?
But the government definitions are quite long-winded too. And I'm actually interested in this point you made that the definitions are not that precise.
Yeah.
I offered a slightly cynical interpretation of that imprecision, that it gives you wiggle room, so you don't have to be held accountable. But I suppose there is a more positive view of loose definitions, which it leaves room for innovation, leaves room for local government experimentation. Where on this sort of balance between giving people a little bit of autonomy and giving people no direction at all, do you think the definition of high-quality growth falls? Do you think it's tight enough?
I think we know the direction. I think endogenous demand is very important. It's becoming more so as what you have laid out in your opening remark, external constraints. So consumption GDP ratio clearly should be increased. But of course, China's consumption GDP ratio can never reach your country's level, right? I mean, that UK, US are 70%. But I think, can China achieve Korea's level? Can China achieve Malaysia's level? I think that's entirely feasible. So if you do that, that will be a very long period of consumption boom. So all you have to do is go to 60%. So that's one way to define that. Because then related definition is you need to have the framework to give disincentive for investment, particularly infrastructure, right? Because of lower rate of return. Another related definition is common prosperity. So I would define common prosperity as a much larger middle class. Again, you can give your own definition. I know you always do that on your magazine.
So, I mean, China's policymakers have been talking about consumption for a very long time. They've been talking about rebalancing for a very long time. It definitely predates Xi Jinping, probably goes back to 2003, if not before. And obviously, they've not had huge success. So what are they doing wrong? What could they do to improve the consumption ratio in China?
Oh, there are many ways to do that. As you said, it's difficult to reform. I mean, I often say this. How do you ask a creditor to change his behavior, right? I mean, I don't owe you money, so why do I have to do what you ask me to do? That's like conversation between US and Japan many years ago, right? So, you may say China was aware of this, but did not act decisively because until 2012, the implicit assumption was external demand was unlimited.
Okay.
I don't know whether you agree with that.
So the thought was that there was no reason to spur consumption because if you had a shortfall in spending in the economy, you could rely on foreign consumers to be the customer of last resort.
Because by 2008, right, China introduced this large stimulus package, October 2008, responding to global financial crisis. And for a year, growth was double digit, but quickly growth petered out. Then the issue was whether we need to unwind that. That was very difficult, both economically and politically. So in 2013, I think one of the considerations for unveiling Belt and Road initiative was whether demand could have been redefined if we open up some of this landlocked economy, right? So, all these countries in Central Asia, and can we unlock economic potential if you have better connectivity? And if that's the case, maybe we don't have to consolidate certain industries because consolidation is difficult. I think that's, I sometimes feel maybe in our culture, we Chinese are good at doing certain things, not good at. I think we are very good at making small things very big, expansion, right? Investment. but to make big things smaller, that's difficult.
Right. I was speaking earlier at breakfast with Sitao about a trip we made to Ningxia many years ago when Sitao was still at The Economist. And I remember there they were talking about their variety of industries orientated towards Central Asia. They had some halal foods. They had wine as well. It's an interesting combination.
I know.
And goji berries. It'd be interesting to go back there and see if any of those industries have flourished.
I think FCC will have an interesting talk on whether China will become a super country on wines, I think, in a few weeks.
Right. That'd be certainly a high quality consumption there. I guess there are different reasons to pursue consumption, though. One that you alluded to is this feeling that perhaps you can't rely on foreign markets anymore. You need some other mainstay.
I think trade war,
growth.
that's it. That's a wake-up call.
Okay. So the pursuit of consumption is more about ensuring stability for the economy than it is about improving the sort of welfare and well-being of households.
Yeah, I think more than that, because if you look at China's manufacturing sector, so in a simplistic way, I feel it's very lopsided, right? So the upstream industries, very few players. So because China is a massive importer of commodity and energy, and the closer you are to consumers and more competition. In China these days, there is a term, 内卷. I don't know how to translate. It just means internal competition, ferocious. So I give you another example. Before I came to Hong Kong, right? So this is a Swiss company, extremely profitable. It's ramping up investment in China. So, but you need to, these days, ESG is important, a lot of ESG, law firm and all this. So one issue is overtime. So Chinese workers, they really hate it when overtime was not allowed.
Okay.
I mean, it's unthinkable, right? In your country, for example. I mean, you strike a lot all the time. So anyway, Simon, the point I want to make, right, is stimulus package in past, example 2008. So the lion's share of the benefit actually was being reflected by higher commodity prices and energy price. But for most Chinese companies, the pricing power remained quite weak because competition. So I think not just consumption, because large fiscal stimulus package, you actually transfer most of the wealth to countries like Australia and Brazil.
So I'm interested in whether this has changed at all in recent years, because you talk about the very hardworking culture, the wish for more overtime, not less, but you also hear a lot now about lying flat, involution.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, China is, in certain parts of the country, at a level of prosperity where it's legitimate to start thinking about other things than purely income.
Right.
So have you detected any sort of shift in these mores, in these social norms, in recent years?
So lying flat, by the way, do you think that's positive or negative?
Lying flat? No, I think it's a negative, but it does suggest that people now have more than just one objective.
So why do you think that's negative? So do you think we should use that to describe French? No, I don't think it's a negative, because I think lying flat is a different way to look at the work-life balance. So that's something I think my generation just doesn't get it. But for younger generation, they understand it. So that is why you look at all these global consumer goods companies in China, they don't target customers like me. They only look at young consumers. I was in Shanghai Auto Show a few weeks ago. I was blown away. I could not find any Chinese who are older than I am. Only older people are German engineers and Japanese executives.
I don't know if that's because China's changing or because you're changing.
Okay.
But I'm interested in this question of lying flat, whether it's a negative or a positive thing. You think it's positive?
I think it's It depends. It's not entirely negative.
Would you like to weigh in? Actually, if you wait, a mic will come to you, and there's also a lady here who'd like to speak. So why don't I take this question first, and then come to the lady over there?
Yeah, it's a quick one. One of the things I haven't figured out is this thing is they say, oh, great. The people that are selling consumer goods are targeting the lying flat generation, but if their whole objective is to do as little as possible and earn as little as possible, what makes them an attractive target for people trying to sell consumer goods? These guys are saying, I want to make the absolute bare minimum to live. What are you going to sell to them?
Yeah.
Why don't we get the second question?
Yeah.
So there's also a question over here.
Thank you. I guess just speaking as a relatively young person, though, I felt lying flat is more a statement of now social mobility has slowed down materially, so no matter how hard you work, you're not going to get your life better. I feel that's one of the major reasons why young people are saying, you know, I'm lying flat, because 20 years ago, if you work so hard, you can change your life, but now you can't. So I'm just curious, like, how should really we interpret young people's statement regarding really the high quality growth, which is really going to improve the social mobility?
Yeah.
So we should tackle these two questions in one go?
Yeah, so one question is, what's the point in targeting consumers if they have no money? And the other point, agreeing with me, I think that lying flat is negative, a negative response to a difficult arms race situation.
I mean, see, today's debate, discussion is about China's consumption, right? So for many years, we want Chinese consumers to lower their saving rate, but it's easier said than done, right? I mean, just when interest rates are falling, Chinese consumers are queuing up, refinancing to repay mortgage. Actually, that's not intended policy. Intended policy for people to trade up, consumers to take on more leverage. So, so when we say for young people, I think even young people are lying flat, taking a more positive social outlook. I mean, their saving rate will still be different from Western consumers, right? Because otherwise, you know, China would have achieved this consumption boom already. So to answer your question, and your question, I think, again, related to higher consumption GDP ratio, I think social mobility, just give you one example, right? One example is, can we have a nationalized saving scheme? Right now we don't. So in practice, so if I want to move someone from Beijing, Shanghai to Chengdu, Chongqing, it's actually very difficult, right? So because it's not a national pension scheme, and it's quite cumbersome for her or him to get reimbursed in hospital. So all this, I think, will be changed. As you said, you know, social mobility is important.
Right. I mean, I always think, if I can just interject my own thoughts on this, that it may be that neither of us wants to work overtime, but I can't afford to stop working overtime unless you do too, because I lose status in the eyes of the employer. So there has to be a sort of collective disarmament on some of these questions. So we've talked quite a lot about consumption, but it does feel to me that recently some of the emphasis on consumption has been replaced by an emphasis on other things, in particular self-reliance. Investment in advanced manufacturing, trying to free China from some of the chokehold technologies that it feels the US and the West has over it. So could you talk a little bit about those things? Are they also part of what China means by high quality growth?
So self-reliance, you know, I grew up in the period of self-reliance, so that was a very painful period. Well, I tell you what, right? So in late 80s, China already opened up. I would say per capita GDP late 80s, maybe around $400 US, maybe $500 US. So there was a famous policymaker in charge of agriculture. His name is Du Rensheng. So he asked the Australian ambassador, then Ross Garnett, I know him, Ross Garnett, what's the best way for China to achieve self-reliance in agriculture? So Ross Garnett is the economist, so he said that's quite easy. All China has to do is to remain poor. Then you achieve self-reliance. So then the response from Du Rensheng was, hey, this Aussie guy is quite interesting. Maybe I should talk to him more. So anyway, so I think self-reliance, so at some point, I suspect, ideal scenario, right? So US, China, we work out something, maybe 5% economic activity is related to security, and the other 95%, not really. I mean, I think we're moving toward that discussion.
So you think, Janet Yellen made that speech saying that she wanted as much economic interaction with China as possible, subject to the very big caveat that they would not compromise national security. And many people reacted to that speech by saying, well, where are you going to draw the line? Do you think it's possible?
Well, I'm just saying 5%. Maybe some, you can give a different, you can quantify that differently, right? Maybe 7%, maybe 6%. I don't know. I don't have a number.
But you think it is possible to draw a line?
I think it's possible to clarify a few things. I mean, okay, first of all, we know one of the issues is the subsidy. So I think it's in China's best interest to quantify subsidies in telecom industry, in banking industry, so on and so forth, manufacturing sector. And to be very frank, right, I don't think the result would have been different anyway for many of these sectors, probably the same, but it would be useful to clarify that. I think that's one thing. Secondly, I think this notion, reciprocity, may be being stretched a little bit too far, right? I mean, to give you an example, right? Right now, direct flight between China and US, very difficult. Airfare, just off the charts. But why do you need reciprocity between China and US?
Who do you think is stressing reciprocity too much, China or America?
America.
America.
Yeah.
I certainly felt that way during the Trump administration, that there was this view that any restriction China imposed, America had to mirror. It does feel as if now there's a bigger strategy at work. It's not as mercantile, it's much more focused on national security. And in some ways, that makes the economic relationship between the two countries more fraught.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So that's why I think, because you brought up issue of self-reliance, right? Because for China, you need to rely on imports of commodities and energy. That's not going to be changed.
Right.
That ratio actually will only go up the next 10 years. And China is very keen to champion RCEP, and China wants to join CPTPP. So it actually makes sense for China to open up market to other countries, Europe, for example, UK, for example, right? Japan, Korea, for example. I think China is quite serious about CPTPP.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And on the specific foreign chokehold technologies, it's hard to know what the right response to that is. I mean, clearly, if the West is willing to restrict high-end semiconductors and the equipment that makes them, what is the rational response on China's part?
I don't know what's a rational response, but I think this strategy being touted by U.S. officials, small yard, high fence. It was being implemented many years ago, but quite often Americans, they have short attention span, right? I mean, so I don't know whether that can be sustained.
I'm interested, if anyone in the room has a view on the specific export controls that America introduced in October.
Back to October last year, yes. Yeah. That was a very big move.
It was a big move, and I know that sort of opinion, even in the West, is divided on it. I don't know if anybody in the audience has a strong view either in favor of them or against those controls. It'd be interesting to get a sense of sentiment on that point. We can, gentleman here.
Yeah, I'm a hardcore free market guy, founder of the Lion Rock Institute. So normally I'm, all gates open, but I think in this case, necessary evil. I mean, we can see how badly the access to chips. I mean, the Russians are importing PlayStations and washing machines so they can strip them for chips to put in their military equipment right now. So I guess the Americans are looking at this and saying, even for hardcore business, free market people, it's not ideal. But the American point of view, rational, because that's what matters in military warfare now. And from the Chinese side, rational response is ramp up research, so they can get to parity, although it's going to take a long time to get there.
But you do, your example does underline a difficult point, which is it's quite hard to draw the line between PlayStations and something that can be used in military equipment.
Yeah.
And so the economic implications are potentially quite serious for China, aren't they?
Indeed.
We've talked a little bit about consumption, we've talked a little bit about self-reliance. I'd be keen to talk a little bit about the environment too, which is obviously a part of what high quality growth entails. How successful do you think China has been on making its growth greener?
I think China is quite successful in recent years because 10 years ago, China's view was you pollute first, then you deal with pollution, right? And 7-8 years ago, a similar argument between China and India. So we need technology transfer and compensation in other area. I think now you can see this big difference between Beijing and New Delhi on this. I think China understands unless you take the pain first, you wouldn't be able to set industry standard, and also the external constraints. For example, Europe already binding, so on carbon. So I think China is very serious and also quite successful.
And you mentioned common prosperity earlier, and you had quite a benign definition of common prosperity to expand the middle class as much as possible, which I don't think anyone would object to or disagree with. Obviously, the view of common prosperity outside China, but also amongst certain entrepreneurs in China, is that it's clumsier than that, and that in pursuing an expanded middle class, they have managed to quash the ambition of some of the more celebrated entrepreneurs in China. Do you think, is that true? Has there been any sort of response to that from the government?
So the responses from the government this year, I think, really just I would say just nonstop assurance to private sector. I think the latest appointment of Jack Ma, in the university, this is all quite encouraging. But I would say ultimately what's important is for today we are looking at higher quality growth, right? We are looking at a redefined relationship between consumption and investment. I think ultimately there will be some significant move in equity market to allow private companies to have more access to capital. So I would define that as a registration system. So it's already underway.
And you think those reassurances are working?
Well, I think the way you asked me the question, right, because you really want to see the action, not just the slogan, right? So I think if registration system is being implemented, I think that will be a game changer. Then you won't have to ask me this question.
A question here at the table.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Tracy of Hoiping Ventures. Just to follow up on that, I think some of those actions, whether it's Jack Ma or it's Fan Bao of Renaissance Capital being disappeared, or the punishment of Didi, are sending real shockwaves to the international community and potential foreign investors. And I wonder whether you think the policymakers just think that's a secondary concern compared to what you're talking about now.
I think some of the names, companies you have mentioned, right? Sometimes I'm wondering whether these companies can become global champions, right? So Didi Chuxing, Meituan, a lot of these companies. So I think how should I say this? I think there is a cultural issue. Again, I often say cultural issue. I think very often in China or Asia, you change policies but without saying it, right? I don't know whether that makes sense to you. So that's, do you have a Chinese mother-in-law or Indian mother-in-law? Does she behave the same?
I can't see the analogy between my mother-in-law and.
But this is in Chinese, in Asian culture, right? Parents, whether particularly in-laws, they often they change, but without saying it.
Oh, so you're saying there's been a sort of softening of the policy, but there's been no admission of a mistake?
I'm just saying quite often. Actually, that's not just China. I think that's Asia in general.
Okay. I guess one of the problems is that the actions that you described were so stark and the signal was so strong that to reassure people, you might have to come out and say it a little bit more. But what's your own answer to your question? I mean, what
Tracy, right? Tracy, you have a rhetorical question, but I know where I'm coming from. Yes, yes.
Yes, another question here.
Hi, I'm Natalie Cade from UBS. There's a lot of focus in the market on SOE reform at the moment,
Yeah.
and so I wondered if you could comment on that, whether you have any sense of the will from the central government or from local governments or from the companies themselves to push forward on that front.
I mean, that's a big subject. A few years ago, I think China's central bank governor Yi Gang, floated this idea of neutrality of competition neutrality, right? You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, so private firms and state firms compete on a level playing field?
No, not quite. I think the idea was, so this is how Germans were dealing with the post system. This is how British were dealing with the rail system. This is how French dealing with banks. So is there any way just to quantify subsidies? I think that would be the first step on SOE reform, right? Because the argument from state-owned enterprise really just a social responsibility. So I think that came out. What year? You remind me. I think October 2018.
Okay, so there has been, I mean, our magazine has written that along with the sort of more intrusive party influence in the private sector, there's been some attempt to introduce more business discipline into the SOE sector. And I'm wondering if you have any sense if that's true and how far they've got with that. More professionalization, better KPIs for managers, obviously the sort of mixed ownership listings and so on. Has that agenda moved forward?
I think that agenda is about centralization, right? It's about centralization. But China always moving. There is a Chinese saying, 一放就乱，一管就死. So you either have chaos or you have very stagnated situation. So I think what you have described, right? This is about centralization. So I wouldn't just say that's SOE reform.
Natalie, would you like to share any thoughts on SOE reform? Please,
I think expectations amongst investors are high that
Right.
that this is going to move forward. Obviously, they're focused on dividend payouts, but I think that our general sense is that it will be gradual. It's challenging, and
Yeah.
I think it may move slower than
Yeah.
investors would like it to.
So maybe the other way to look at that is, see, because China's WTO accession was very important, right? Because it's about a framework subject to foreign competition. And recently, China has reiterated its desire, commitment to join CPTPP, which is clearly not easy, right? Because you need everyone's vote. But if China can join CPTPP, I think I think then that external constraint will be at a different level.
We should talk a little bit about the speed of growth. One of the questions I posed at the outset is, if China pursues a higher quality of growth, does that necessarily mean that growth must be slower? And I'm interested in your views of what you think, China's sort of sustainable rate of growth over the next 5, 10 years might be. I'm also interested in the views in the room.
He wants to, yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add a little flavor to that question. Can we even talk about China anymore? I mean, China's GDP per capita is about $12,000 a head, which is less than half that of Taiwan, but Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou is on par with Taiwan, much, much higher. And rural areas, so, I mean, is there really one China when we talk about growth and high quality growth, or do you have go-go cities, sleepy cities, and the rural areas? I mean, 400 million people in China have never been on the internet, which means they've never had a smartphone. Is there one China that we can still talk about, or do we have to talk about different growth in different places?
So to answer his question first, answer your question first.
I think you should give me the sustainable rate of growth for each province in China.
Okay, so I think the sustainable growth is between 4 to 4.5%. The reason I say that is this year, let's say it's 5.5%, but the base effect is very favorable. So in the medium term, so you need to come down, right? Second reason, we also know property sector, no matter how you look at that, it's going to subtract something from growth next 10 years. And in past, always adding something, right? Thirdly, I think capital market reform, that's very important because then you bring more equity, right? Ideally, your equity, then we don't have to lower leverage. But still, you look at various actors of the economy, local government, and large enterprises, they need to reduce their leverage. And consumers are expected to increase the leverage, but not so easy. So that's why I would say 4 to 4.5%. Also with assumption, as that young lady has talked about social mobility, so national saving pension scheme would be rolled out. I think retirement age should be extended. I mean, for women, it's 55. Don't you think that's ridiculous? Right? So if you do the same thing as in France, I mean, there will be zero reaction in China, right? So, so that's why 4 to 4.5%. To answer his question, I think regionalization is actually very distinct feature in China these days. Previously, just a first-tier city, second-tier city, third-tier cities, fourth-tier cities. Now there is even concept quasi-first-tier city. So quasi-first-tier city would be Hangzhou, right? Not quite first-tier, but is way ahead of most second-tier cities. You also have many second-tier cities with favorable demographic, place like Hefei near Shanghai. You also have, I think Greater Bay Area is the most economically dynamic region in the world, right? Population, that's Spain plus Portugal, but a lot more dynamic than Spain and Portugal, right? Connectivity in Greater Bay Area already quite fantastic, but there is still room for improvement. You look at this big bridge between Hong Kong and Zhuhai, I would argue, how come you don't have one leg to Shenzhen? Economic integration between Hong Kong and all these cities. I think there's I mean, in certain area, right, That's Hong Kong's problem, but there is more room for integration. So yeah, I mean, region. So I agree with you. So if you look at China as a whole, I still think it's a work in progress. You didn't put that way, but it's a work in progress.
So you think, we have a question at the front?
Hi, thanks. This is Rebecca from Wall Street Journal. So my question has to do with sustainable growth, but more specifically, I want to ask about local government finances. I think it's, I'm not talking about like public default of LGFVs, but rather just because in the past 20 years or so, China's growth, regional growth, has been so tied up to debt. So with now, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the local governments are struggling with their finances. So what's the strategy now, as you see it? You know, is there, if we cannot borrow anymore, how can we grow?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there is no solution. The only solution is time. I think how do you deal with the leveraged debt, right? So you need to accept just a slightly slower growth rate. You need to tolerate slightly higher inflation. That's the only way. That's why sometimes really there's no silver bullet, just time. At the same time, because consumers' wealth so tied to property market, so you still need the property market to stay. I wouldn't even use the word buoyant, but just staying stable, right? But at least, for residential property market, that's the case. I mean, as the gentleman said, right, China is very fragmented. So you have, even there's no such thing on property market. You have industrial, you have a commercial, you have residential. You have so many different cities, right?
A question here.
So, looking at the topic of this breakfast, is China capable of high-quality growth?
He hasn't asked me that question yet.
My question to you is, how can you achieve high-quality growth without attracting high-quality investors who depend on being their eyes and ears on the ground, not only for initial investment, but for ongoing verification? They rely on companies like CapVision, Mintz, Bain, and China's depriving quality long-term investors of their eyes and ears. So how can you achieve high-quality growth when, from the get-go, you're telling investors, sure, go ahead and invest, but we're not going to let you see what's going on behind the curtain?
No. So I think what this gentleman alluded, right? I mean, broadly speaking, I still think that's China-U.S. is so sometimes China just taking a more defensive stance. So I think that's so very. I mean, I won't get into specific question, right? Because you know more than I do. I really don't know. I don't have preparatory information on individual companies, so I would say that's a big subject. Now, but if you look at higher quality growth, I do think maybe China should take a different approach on human capital. So, for example, if your country imports so many capable nurses from the Philippines, how come China cannot do that? I think China should do that. I think China should bring more doctors from India, right? So I think, but I don't know, I don't want to dodge your question, but I do think we need to look at labor market in a different way.
I mean, it's interesting, if you look at the kind of industries that the high-quality investors previously fell in love with, and I think very prominently of things like EdTech. The government clearly decided
Which
that
one?
what EdTech,
Okay.
so the education technology
Yep.
firms, the government clearly decided that didn't fit their definition of high quality growth. So in certain areas, the government's view of what counts as a good investment for China doesn't match the view of the high quality investors with their eyes and ears on the ground. So I wonder, therefore, if they mind that much that those high quality investors have had those eyes and ears removed, if they have their own strong priors about what counts as a good sector for China in the future, then perhaps a lot of the capital allocation gets taken care of by that. Does that sound? Am I going too far, or?
I think for investors, it would be wise just to understand government's policy priority, right? I already said in the beginning, when you just look at the way the definition of high quality being framed, you could see policy bias towards various industries, right? I mean, clearly the government feels advanced manufacturing sector is more important, right?
Yeah. I'm interested in whether your view, the 4 and 4.5% growth view, strikes our audience as too optimistic, too pessimistic, or about right. So asking for your forgiveness and indulgence, I'd like to do a bit of a stunt. Could you all raise your hands, please? Everybody raise your hands.
Well, before they raise your, they think it's too high or they think it's too
No,
low?
everybody raise your hands. It'll all become clear in a minute. If you think that Sitao is being too pessimistic and you think China can grow sustainably faster than 4.5%, please lower your hand. If you think he got it about right, please lower your hand.
Okay.
So the remainder, I think, of the view that it's actually China will struggle to reach 4 and 4.5%.
So this is what Simon Cox did last week. This is Economist magazine. So Simon Cox was, economists never give people bylines. So that's so Simon Cox was a principal writer of Peak China.
That's right. Well, 4.5% would allow China to overtake the U.S.
So this is a simple math. So we can look at the U.S. Our view is sustainable growth rate in the U.S. around 1.7, 1.8%. So if China grows 4%, assuming exchange rate stays constant, exchange rate actually has weakened a little bit in recent days, Chinese RMB. So that would take China to 2035. No, 2038. So if we say it's 4.5%, then it's 2035.
Right, and just to explain, peak China, it's a slippery term. It's been bandied about for a couple of years now, especially in Washington. But the way to make sense of it, the way to operationalize it, is to think of China's power relative to the US, or, if you're an economist, China's GDP relative to the US. And there's a view that within the foreseeable future, maybe a decade, maybe 2 or 3 decades, China's GDP relative to the US might actually reach a peak. So it may overtake, it may amass a lead, but that lead at a certain point will stop rising. By implication, China will grow at the same pace as the US. Now, 10 years ago, people didn't really think this. As far as the eye could see, you imagine that chart of China's GDP relative to the US going up and up and up. But more recently, there's a view that a peak is sort of within sight. And again, people place the date differently, but it's certainly an interesting topic to talk about. And it also sort of focuses discussion not just on when China might overtake, but how big the lead might be. Because if it amasses a lead of, say, 10%, that's not a great deal geopolitically. It doesn't really change anything geopolitically. If it amasses a lead of 30, 40, 50%, then clearly it becomes the center of economic gravity, which would have all sorts of geopolitical implications. So that's the sort of peak China discussion, which obviously follows a little bit from what we've been talking about here. What's your own view? Do you think China's GDP will peak relative to the US within your lifetime?
I think, well, what's my lifetime? I think well, that gentleman already used Taiwan as a benchmark, right? Actually, Taiwan's per capita GDP now is 32,000. So it's the first time, because previously always Japan, Taiwan, Korea, they changed positions. So first time in history actually is Taiwan followed by Korea, followed by Japan. That also due to exchange rate. So I think is 32 too high? I mean, China is a big country. I mean, 32 is quite difficult. But can China achieve 20,000? I think the answer is yes.
And coming back to the question here, the particular problems that local governments are facing with their indebtedness, that's priced into your 4 and 4.5% forecast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if you really reform capital market, some of these issues will be resolved, right? There's no reason for local government not to tap into capital market. There's no reason for China not to have the biggest municipal bond market, right? Because right now just everyone is borrowing at the credit of central government. That's not sustainable anyway.
That does seem to be changing a bit though, right? There seems to be a bit more differentiation in spreads, certainly for local government financing vehicles. Okay, well, we've been going for a while, and we're sort of coming to the end of our time here. But if anyone has any further questions for Sitao, now's your chance.
So,
gentleman here.
Mike Rouse.
how are you?
I'm 50-year resident of Hong Kong. I guess it's a comment in response to what my good friend, who's now left, was saying before. It seems to me that the constraints that America is putting on trade and all investment relationships with China is raising a moral question, which in fairness the Economist did touch very briefly on in one of the editorials, which to what extent is it right to hold back the growth and improvement of life quality of one country as a deliberate act in order to make yourself feel superior?
Wow. So that's your question?
It is a question and a comment.
Oh, okay.
Because I think these constraints, there's a list, we will never buy these products from you, even if they are the best in the world and competitively priced.
Right.
We will never sell these products to you, even though they would improve your quality of life in all sorts of non-military ways, as well as possibly some military ones. We will never allow you to invest in these sectors. We will never allow our companies to invest in these sectors in China. There are at least 4 lists, and I probably haven't listed them all, but they all seem designed to restrain Chinese growth. And why Chinese growth, of course, it has geopolitical meaning, but it also is the quality of life and standard of living of Chinese people.
Yeah. I mean, I said at the beginning, I'm a development economist by training, and I personally find it very awkward and upsetting that a story that used to be told through the framework of development economics, where you celebrate growth and success, marvel at it, hope to learn from it, now it's being discussed purely in the geopolitical frame, which is obviously a necessary perspective, but it's important not to lose sight of the fact that people who are not very rich, their livelihoods are at stake here.
But I still think China and US may find a new equilibrium, right? I mean, new equilibrium requires more players in commerce. But for various reasons, right? You read today's FT, and Ford has changed its strategy in China. That has nothing to do with China. So in past, a lot of US companies were lobbying on behalf of China. For various reasons, they are no longer successful, right? General Electric, and Simon, many years ago, going for greener pasture to Bank of New York, but without a faster pace of financial liberalization, those companies won't be able to play a meaningful role in China. So I think we need a new equilibrium between China and US.
Well, that sounds like a good note on which to end. So
Okay.
Sitao, thanks
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you, thank you.
Please, a round of applause.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Simon.